we'd like to open to Ruth chapter 2 this evening. The book of Ruth and chapter 2. It really has been a nice day. We get to spend so much extra time together than most Sundays, and just to be with friends, really. And that's what we're going to be looking at tonight, is the idea of friendship as presented in the book of Ruth. And Proverbs chapter 17. Proverbs 17:17 says, "A friend loves at all times." And kind of the idea of that proverb is there's some ways in which a friend maybe is even closer than family at times. And a friend is someone that you can count on, really, no matter what's happening in life. Someone that you can turn to no matter how difficult things get. Someone that you can depend on, whether you've messed something up or just whatever is happening in life. That's what a true friend, what a scriptural friend is. And that's what we find with the people in the book of Ruth. In fact, the name Ruth means friend. That's what her name means. She is a friend to Naomi especially. Chapter 2 reveals the powerful results that come from being a friend to someone. And Ruth and Boaz are in particular, they're selfless kinds of friends. It opens up in chapter 2 and verse 1, and it introduces Boaz to us. We've not really heard of him before chapter 2. And it tells us that he's a relative of Naomi's and that he is a man of great wealth. But of course, not knowing who he is yet in the story, it's kind of the idea that there's a lot of potential there. There's the possibility he's in a position to help Naomi and Ruth, and he has the means. He has the wealth to help Naomi and Ruth. But what kind of person is he? And remember, they live in the time of the Judges. They live in a time when people, the way it's described in the book of Judges is everybody did what was right in his own eyes. And so is he the kind of person who would help, or is he someone who would take advantage of them? We don't really know yet by this point in the book. And so the potential is there. But of course, we know Ruth. And Ruth is there to take care of Naomi. And that's what she's thinking about. They've moved back to Bethlehem. And she's thinking about where their meals are going to come from. And so she asks permission of her mother-in-law. She says, "Can I go to find a field and to glean some from that field so that we have something to eat?" And, when you think about Naomi, we don't really know exactly how old she is at this point. We know she's older than Ruth, of course, but we don't really know, is she very physically capable, or is she not very physically capable? And it's kind of curious because in chapter 1, she really tries hard to get Ruth and Orpah to go away, or to go back to their mother's household. And she says repeatedly in chapter 1, she says, "God has left me with nothing. God has left me empty. I have nothing." And it's almost like she's forgotten about the provisions that God put in his law for the poor. In particular, Leviticus chapter 19 and verses 9 through 10. In Leviticus chapter 19, God's law in the Old Testament is really very neat. And it's really very clever the way that he handled some of society's problems. And Leviticus chapter 19, and starting in verse 9, there's instructions to the landowners, to the farmers of the day. He says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God." And so, in essence there, what God says is he hasn't left the responsibility of feeding the poor to the government or to the king. He's left it to the people of means. He's left it to the people who has wealth, but he's done it in a way that allows these people to kind of work for themselves. He says, you can harvest your field, but leave the corners of your field where you haven't harvested them. Leave some of that there. And what that does is it allows the poor to come, and it allows them to pull down that grain with their own hands. And so they have the dignity of working, but they have a place to go where they can do that if people are following after the law of God. And so when Naomi tells Ruth and Orpah, "Go home. I can't do anything for you. I can't help you," my kind of wondering is, because she doesn't seem to be capable of going to the field herself, who did she think was going to do that for her? She didn't, her land had been sold to somebody else when they left to go to Moab, and she was sending home the only people who were guaranteed going to help her go in God's provision to gather grain so that they have something to eat. Now, thankfully, Ruth stuck with her through all of that, but she says she's going to go out, and Naomi says she can go and find a field to work in. And remember, this is the time of the judges, a dangerous time for a young woman to go out by herself and to be gathering grain like this. But she happens to land in the field of Boaz, and then we kind of get a sense of who Boaz is. He shows up, and the first thing he does is he offers them a traditional greeting when he's speaking to his reapers. He says, "The Lord be with you," and they reply, in reply, they say, "The Lord bless you." And so right from the start, we have a good impression of Boaz. He's somebody who, when he greets people with the Lord in mind. But, that doesn't always mean anything. You've probably met people who, they're very religious when you first meet them, but that's not who they are in reality. Or you think about those people who, the backs of their cars as window stickers and bumper stickers, all about how they love Jesus and where do they go to church, but then you see the way that they get angry when they drive, and you think, well, at least in this moment, they're having a rough moment, aren't they? And so, sometimes we can get a good first impression, but it doesn't really tell us who a person is. And so he leaves a good first impression, but he notices Ruth, and he says, the people in charge, he says, "Whose young woman is this?" And so they say, "Well, this is Ruth the Moabite, and she came with Naomi back to Bethlehem, and she asked us, could she work in our field today?" And so we said, "Well, you can." And they say she's been working really hard. And she took a little break when she got hot in the house, but she's been working really hard all morning long. And so they compliment Ruth and the work that she is doing to take care of Naomi. And so Boaz comes to her, and he gets her attention. He says, "You will listen, my daughter, will you not?" And in essence, he's trying to get her attention. And he says, "Do not go to glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young women. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." And so, in essence, and perhaps this is why she picked this field, he says there's apparently several poor women who come to this field so that they can take from the sides of it, just like God's law allows them to do. And so she's chosen this field, and he says, stay close to them. Don't go anywhere else. He says, "I've commanded my young men not to touch you." This was the danger that people were afraid of in this time, that a young woman out on her own in a field was in a precarious situation. And he says, "My young men respect me. They'll listen to me. And so if you stay here, they'll watch after you, and you will be safe. You'll be with these other young women." And so he makes her these promises. And she falls to the ground, and she's very grateful. And she wants to know, why are you doing this for me? Especially, she says, because I am not like the other women here. I'm a foreigner. Why are you doing this for me? And his response, he says, is because he sees how well she takes care of Naomi. He says, "It has been fully reported to me, all that you have done for your mother-in-law, since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father, and you've left your mother and the land of your birth, and you have come to a people whom you did not know before. The Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." And so he says, because you were a friend to Naomi, I want to be a friend to you. That's what Proverbs 18:24 describes. In Proverbs 18:24, he says to have a friend, you have to be a friend, or you have to be friendly. And that if you choose to treat people as a friend would treat people, you're going to draw those kinds of friends to you. You're going to draw those kinds of people to you. She is helping out Naomi. And so Boaz says, "I want to help take care of you." And he mentions it there in verse 12. He says, "You have come under the wings of God for refuge." And I love that idea, and the Bible uses it several times to describe how God wants to protect us. He wants to take us under his wings. This is Psalm 36 in verses 7 and 8. In Psalm 36, starting in verse 7, he says, "How precious is your loving kindness, O God! Therefore the children of men put their trust under the shadow of your wings. They are abundantly satisfied with the fullness of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your pleasures. He says that they trust in him not just to provide the physical things, which is what Ruth is looking for here, but a spiritual satisfaction. And that God is like a mother bird who hides them under his wings, who pulls them close and keeps them safe. This is like Psalm 61 in verses 4 and 5. Psalm 61, starting in verse 4, David writes, he says, I will abide in your tabernacle forever. I will trust in the shelter of your wings. For you, O God, have heard my vows. And I think especially about Ruth in context of this, because that's what she did, isn't it? She made a vow to Naomi. She said, I'm committing myself to you and to your God. It says God heard that vow. And so Boaz is saying she is under the shelter of his wing because she stays with that commitment, because she is working hard to take care of her. She is under the protection that God provides. This is what Jesus says in Matthew 23 and verse 37. Matthew 23 and verse 37, as he looks out over Jerusalem and he thinks about how someday it will be torn down, he says, how I have longed to take you under my wing like a mother hen takes her chicks, and just to hold you close, just to keep you safe from all the terrible things that are coming. That's what God still wants to do for us today. He still wants to take us under his wing and to protect us from the spiritual dangers in life, from the temptations and the difficulties that might pull us away. He wants to keep us safe. And if we are committed to God in the way that Ruth was committed to Naomi, we will be under that protection that God provides. Now, Boaz, of course, his actions very much match his words. And so after he speaks with her, he says in verse 13, or she says in verse 13, she says, let me find favor in your sight, for you have comforted me and have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants. And then she goes back to work. But Boaz pulls aside his reapers, and he, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. At mealtime, it says, he asked her to come and to eat the bread and to dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. And so she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her, and she ate and was satisfied, and she kept some back. And so, in essence, what he's doing is he's hired these people to come and to work for him, these men. He went down to the corner, and a whole bunch of people climbed in the bed of his truck, and he took them back to the field. And y'all think Boaz probably drove a Chevy or a Ford? I'm not really sure, but right, he hired these people, and so he's providing them lunch. And that was part of the deal: wages for the day, lunch to eat. He doesn't have to give Ruth lunch. He didn't hire her for the day. She's there getting what she needs to eat from the edges of his field. He doesn't have to do that, but he is going above and beyond to take care of her, to provide more than he has to. After she went back to work, he commanded the men. He says, if she goes into the center of the field and not on the edges, don't rebuke her. Let her go into this, wherever in the field she goes. Let her go and take as much as she wants. When you're binding up the sheaves, he says, give it a little shake and let some of it fall out on the ground. Make it too easy for her to gather as much as she needs and as much as she wants. He says, help her out in whatever way that you possibly can. He is going above and beyond to make sure that she's able to provide for Naomi. And so, verse 17, she gleaned in the field until evening. She beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Now, an ephah of barley, if a single man had an ephah of barley, he could probably eat on that for an entire month. You think a young single man probably eats more than a young single woman like Ruth, and especially more than an older woman who's probably not getting around too much. He can eat on that for a month. And so what she has beat out and collected that day is food that will last them for quite a while. Now, she's going to keep gathering because she knows the seasons are coming when there's nothing to gather. And she's like a chipmunk or a squirrel. She's got to store that away for winter. But right in one day, because of how generous, because of what a friend Boaz was, she went from having practically no food to food that will last them for quite some time. In verse 18, it says, she took it up and she went into the city. She went to her mother-in-law, and she saw what she had gleaned. And she brought it out and she gave her what she had kept back after she had been satisfied. That's when he gave her that lunch that he didn't have to give her. She ate as much as she was until she was full, and then she kept the rest of it. And so she took home all that she had gleaned, and she took home her doggy bag of leftovers from lunchtime. And so Naomi says, where did all this come from? Whose field did you work in? Who took such care of you? Who took notice of you? And she says, well, the man's name whom I'm worked with today is Boaz. And that's Naomi, who almost had nobody, is provided for because Ruth was a friend. She's a caretaker. Naomi now has all of this food because Ruth lives very much what James chapter 1 and verse 27 describes. In James chapter 1 and verse 27, it says, pure and undefiled religion before God is this, to keep oneself unspotted from the world, but also to visit orphans and widows in their trouble. And visit is not like a social visit. Visit is the idea that when they have need, you meet it. You take care of them. You provide for them in whatever way you can. That's the life that Ruth is living. She is taking care of this widow, Naomi, in her trouble. And she cannot get this food for herself. She's very much living the life of Matthew chapter 6 and verses 33 and 34. Jesus says in Matthew 6:33, just seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and God will provide the daily clothes and the daily food that you need. He says in verse 34, he says, do not worry about tomorrow. Enough for today are its own troubles. Ruth knows that they're going back and they may not really know where they're going to live. They might have to live on the street. She knows that Naomi has no food for her, but she says, we're just going to take it one day at a time, and we're just going to trust. God is going to give us what we need. He's going to provide for us. She is living that life and receiving the abundant blessings of God. And Boaz is the perfect picture of, you all know my favorite Greek word for good, right? I talk about it all the time, I know. You're probably tired of hearing about it by now. But that's where your mother, she'll feed you the basic necessities of life, but your grandma's going to give you a full 3-course meal, right? She's going to provide for you more than what you need. And that's the Greek word for good. You help people, not just with the bare minimum, but more than what you need. That's what Boaz is. He's not just, yes, you can work along the edges of my field. He had to do that. If he was going to be right with God, according to Leviticus 19, he had to let her work along the edges of his field. That's the bare minimum. But he's going to go above and beyond. He's going to feed her lunch when he doesn't have to. He's going to make sure that they're making it too easy for her. It's what Paul describes in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10. And when in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, he says that to do good to all people, right? We meet people's needs beyond their minimum, no matter who they are. But especially, he says, for the household of faith, especially for one another. If one of us has a need, we meet that need beyond just the bare minimum. We give more than we have to help each other out. And that's Ruth, he says, even though she's from Moab, he says, you're one of us. You have committed yourself to Naomi and to her God. You are treating her the way that God would want you to. And so he is taking care of her above and beyond what he has to. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 28. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 28, he says, here's why we work, so that we have something to give to those who have need. That we can do good, he says. We can help people who have need with more than just the bare minimum. We're able to provide and to help those people. That's the life that Boaz is trying to live. But Boaz, throughout the book, he really is a type of Christ. He's a type of Christ, and we haven't gotten into it yet. We will in a minute, but we'll talk about the kinsman redeemer idea, and that he redeemed them from their impoverished situation. And that is a picture of what Christ does for us. That sin impoverishes us, it enslaves us, and that Christ came to redeem us from that impoverished situation. But he's also a type of Christ here, if you look in Romans chapter 5. Romans chapter 5, and starting in verse 7. Romans 5:7, he says, for scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man, someone would even dare to die. And in other words, what he's saying there is, if someone is a rule follower, that's the righteous man in this context. If he's a rule follower, maybe somebody would take his place if he was supposed to die. They'd die for the rule follower. But he says scarce, right? It doesn't really happen very often. But if someone was a good man, that is, he helps people not just by the rules, but beyond what the rule says. He does more for them than what the rules require. If he is good, it says it's more likely, slightly more likely, that somebody would die for him. Maybe that would happen. But verse 8, God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, we were not righteous or good. We couldn't fit in either of those categories. We were sinners. We were impoverished and enslaved by sin. He says Christ died for us. And that, in the type, that's true of Ruth and Naomi. They have nothing that they can give Boaz. They have nothing that they can offer him. They have no wealth of their own that he should sacrifice and provide for them. But while they were in that state, he made those sacrifices. He provided for them. And so he begins in chapter 2 to be a type of Christ. Now, this friendship that they offer Naomi, it changes everything for her. It's what makes the difference. It's what turns her from Mara when she said, don't call me Naomi, right? Call me bitter. Call me Mara. Back into Naomi. And she says in verse 20, she says, blessed be he of the Lord who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and to the dead. She has hope again. Chapter 1, she said, God has forsaken me. He's turned his hand against me. He wants nothing to do with me. He's cursed my family. And here she says that blessed be God who has not forsaken the living and the dead. She says, this is the reason, she says in verse 20, this man is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives. She can see the reason to have hope again. Not only is she physically provided for, but she sees God's providence to bring about that rest that she had lost when she went there. Now, what she's referring to here is in Leviticus chapter 25. In Leviticus chapter 25, and starting in verse 23, it describes the kinsman redeemer. And it says in Leviticus 25:23, it says, the land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine, and you are strangers and sojourners with me. And in all the land, your possession, your land shall grant redemption of the land. If one of your brethren becomes poor and has sold some of his possession, and if his redeeming relatives comes to redeem it, then he may redeem what his brother has sold. In other words, God told them where they were going to live. This tribe will live there, and that tribe will live here. And the families, they broke that land up, and he says, don't change that. Wherever your land is, that's to be yours for as long as your people live in the promised land. But if someone gets poor and they can't pay off their debts, they can sell the land temporarily to pay off their debts. But if they have a brother who can come and buy it back for them, let that brother do it. Let him redeem that land back. And that's what Naomi is talking about here. She says he is a close relative. He has the wealth, that's what verse 1 told us, and the connection that he could buy our land back for us and restore to us what God said. God said, the land is mine, and I want those families living on their own land. He can make that happen. And so Ruth says, she says, he also said to me, you shall stay close by my young men until they have finished my harvest. And so Naomi agreed. She says, it's good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women and that people do not meet you in any other field. And so she stayed close by the young women of Boaz to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the end of the wheat harvest. And she dwelt with her mother-in-law. Because she has hope again, hope guides her actions so that she can stay in Boaz's field. It's friendship. Ruth and Boaz's friendship that ultimately awakened Naomi's faith. She had given up. She said, God has cursed me. But she believes again. She has faith again. Because now she can see that all along, God was working behind the scenes. And that's what Matthew 7:11 talks about. Matthew 7:11, when it says, that evil fathers, right? Fathers who commit harm sometimes, that even they know how to get good gifts. But God, our Father, who never does anything evil, he knows how to give us good gifts no matter what. And so sometimes we can't see it, just like Naomi couldn't. She couldn't see how God was giving her good gifts. She couldn't see that his law and that Ruth were the things that she needed. But with time, because Ruth didn't give up on her, because Boaz was a friend to them. With time, she was able to build her faith back up. She was able to see the good gifts that God was giving her. Do good. Visit widows and orphans. Be a friend to one another, especially when someone's faith is down, especially when somebody is struggling to stay committed. Be a friend to them and watch how God might work the same kind of things through you. And if we can help you do that this evening, we ask that you come as we stand, that you come forward as we stand and sing.